Happy Mother's Day to everybody. I hope that you mothers will be properly treated today as is fitting. We have Renee here today. She's originally from Brazil and friends of my memory, Boone and Vivian, and she lives in Tasmania. She's come up here to get some warm weather. Tassie now is well on the way to winter, and their winter is a bit colder than our winter, so it's good to have you here. I set out, as I always do, to preach a lesson regarding Mother's Day, and so I had some ideas in my mind, and I googled the topic of protective maternal instinct among birds and animals. And I was kind of surprised by what came up, because the leading articles that came up were feminist articles strongly reacting against the idea of maternal instinct, mother instinct. And one article said that the idea of maternal instinct was a myth invented by men. Now, I'm fully aware that maternal instinct is not universal amongst all women, though the fact is that a lot of women do desire children. And I'm aware that birds and animals don't all display the same protective instinct towards their young, and therefore we cannot use all birds and animals as an illustration about parents protecting their children among humans. However, the Bible does talk about love for children. Titus 2 and verse 4 talks about women loving their children, just as Proverbs 13 and verse 24 mentions the idea of fathers loving their children. And the fact is that in this regard, birds and animals, some of them do provide an illustration. We would hardly think it right to be a parent and yet to care nothing for our children. The Bible, on a number of occasions, uses birds and animals to illustrate this principle. And we have God's care for humans illustrated by various animals and birds. And in turn, just as God loves us, so we are indeed to love our children, and indeed do love our children in most cases. Unfortunately, some do have problems with that. There are a number of passages that I'd like to refer to first of all. The first one is the one that Isaac just read to us from Deuteronomy 32, beginning in verse 8. We've got verses 8 and 9. When the Most High gave the nations their inheritance, when he separated the sons of mankind, he set the boundaries of the peoples according to the number of the sons of Israel. For the Lord's portion is his people. Jacob is the allotment of his inheritance. And Jacob, of course, is the father of the 12 sons and one daughter, and they provided the basis of the 12 tribes of Israel. And the idea here in verse 8 seems to be that when God was planning the idea of the various nations, in that he made room for Israel with Israel's population. So the idea is God was showing special consideration for his people. He cared for them. Verse 10, he found him, God found Jacob, and Jacob stands for Israel. He found him in a desert land and in the howling wasteland of a wilderness. He encircled him, he cared for him, he guarded him as the apple of his eye. and that seems to be speaking of the Israelites there, as both in Egypt and then particularly as they wandered in the wilderness for 40 years. In fact, if you go back to Deuteronomy 8 verses 14 through 16, you get a description there of the tough nature of the wilderness. And again, God is pictured as caring for his people. Verse 11, as an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over its young, he spread his wings, he caught them, he carried them on his pinions. So God there is pictured as caring for Israel as an eagle stirs up its nest and hovers over its young. Now, the Hebrew word there that's translated eagle may not be limited to eagles. It may refer to birds of a larger size, such as eagles, but nevertheless, the idea here is the protective care of a bird for its young and training them for flight. You've got the word pinions at the end of verse 11. It's from a Hebrew word which can refer to feathers or to wings. Nowadays, the pinion is a special feather on birds' wings, the flight feathers, as I understand it. But again, the idea here is of birds protecting their young, and that's what God does for his people. You can get another such passage over in Isaiah 31 and verse 5. There's a lot of passages that relate to this. I just haven't got time to deal with them all. But Isaiah 31 and verse 5, like flying birds, so the Lord of armies will protect Jerusalem. He will protect and save it. He will pass over and rescue it. Now there's a mixed metaphor there in verse 5. But the idea in the first part of the verse is flying birds protecting their young, and so God in the same way will protect Jerusalem. And the idea of the word that's translated flying there in verse 5 could also mean covering, so a bird protectively covering its young. And then one more example. We'll go over to the New Testament, to Matthew 23 and verse 37. And Jesus is here speaking. He is in Jerusalem in the days leading up to his arrest and crucifixion. And he says this, Matthew 23 verse 37, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, who kills the prophets and stones those who have sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together the way a hen gathers her chicks under her wings, and you were unwilling. So again, you see that idea of a bird protectively covering its young, looking after them. And that idea of covering the young with wings is used quite a few times in the book of Psalms to illustrate God's care for his people. Psalm 17:8, 61:4, and we can keep going there. So this idea of God's care for his people and the illustration of that with a bird protecting its young is there in the Bible. And furthermore, just as God protects us, there is the idea that we naturally should be protecting our children, that we should show protective care for them. And that's both mothers and fathers. It's not limited just to mothers. Proverbs 31 and verse 15, she rises while it is still night and gives food to her household and portions to her attendants. And that's the description there of a godly wife and mother. And then if we go over into the New Testament, Matthew 7 verses 9 through to 11, we've got the idea of fathers caring for their children. So it's not just the mother's responsibility. Matthew 7 and where did I say it was? Verse 9, Um, or what person is there among you who, when his son asks for a loaf of bread, will give him a stone? Or if he asks him for a fish, he will not give him a snake, will he? So if you, despite being evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father who is in heaven give good things to those who ask him? So we've got the illustration of particularly birds that I've talked about, who are protective towards their young. That illustrates God's care and Christ's care for their people. And in turn, there is also the human parental care, both father and mother towards their children. And that's what I want to talk about today, particularly in regard to mothers, but making the point that this parenthood is not just the mother's responsibility, it's also the father's responsibility. We live in a society today here in Australia which expects adults in general and parents in particular to care for their children. Now that hasn't always been the case in various parts of the world. Down through the ages there has been the practice of what we call infanticide, the killing of children. And that's been practiced in various civilizations. You remember that the Pharaoh in Egypt tried to wipe out the Israelites by having their male sons killed. In Jeremiah 19 verses 3 through 5, there's a reference there to children being offered as burnt offerings. Encyclopedia Britannica speaks of children being killed, quote, in the belief that it would ensure health, good fortune, and general fertility. Now, we don't do that anymore. We say that we're better than that, although when it comes to abortion, you have to ask the question, are we so much better? Because abortion now is taken much further than it was spoken of back in the 1960s, where now the idea is that you should be able to abort a child right up to the point of birth, when clearly you have a viable, living human being. But generally speaking, our society does show care for infants and young people. You only have to read the newspapers or watch the TV news over the years. The media has condemned instances of child abuse, particularly sexual abuse in churches and other institutions, and we've had inquiries into that not only here in Australia but in other places as well. There's been a strong reaction regarding that. There's been news stories about children being neglected and mistreated by their parents. There's been news stories, I remember, down through the years of children left in the car while in the casino car park while their parents went in to the casino to gamble. And I remember news stories about that occurring with the casino over in Perth. And we would consider that to be totally unacceptable. There's stories of children being left on their own at home while parents go out in the evening to have a good time. And back years ago when I worked with the Youth Line telephone counselling service, I remember dealing with at least one young boy who rang in where that's what was happening. He was left at home on his own. So we as a society do not approve of child abuse, child neglect, child mistreatment. We expect children to be treated kindly and to be protected and being nurtured and trained and so forth. Now, from what I've seen down through the years, most mothers in society are strongly protective towards their children. Today, as I've already said, I want to look at three particular areas in which, yes, mothers, but also fathers can show the sort of protective care that God shows and that is illustrated by birds and animals. The first thing is to be protective of our children in regard to sin and Satan. Now, it's true that all of us eventually have to give account of our own selves to God. And our children will grow up and they will make their decisions and they will be accountable to God for their decisions. But mothers, just as well as fathers, can do as much as we can to point our children in the right direction. Ephesians chapter 6 and verse 4 talks about a father's responsibility in regard to this. Ephesians 6 and verse 4, fathers, do not provoke your children to anger, but bring them up in the discipline and instruction of the Lord. But if we go over to 2 Timothy chapter 1, and first of all verse 5, we see too this idea of a mother helping her children, spiritually speaking. 2 Timothy 1 and verse 5, for I am mindful, and this is Paul writing to Timothy, I am mindful of the sincere faith within you, which first dwelt in your grandmother Lois and your mother Eunice, and I am sure it is in you as well. So there's 3 generations of faith. Why isn't the father mentioned? The father was not Jewish. The father was not a believer. He's not named as a believer back in Acts 16 and verse 1. So it was the grandmother, the mother, and then Timothy that all had faith. And if you go over the page to 2 Timothy chapter 3 verse 14, you've got Paul saying this to Timothy, you, however, continue in the things you have learned and become convinced of, knowing from whom you have learned, and that from childhood you have known the sacred writings which are able to give you the wisdom that leads to salvation through faith which is in Christ Jesus. Well, who was there to teach Timothy from childhood? It appears to be his grandmother and his mother. They did that. Indeed, in verse 14, it says, knowing from whom you have learned them. Well, in the Greek, that word whom is plural, which again would fit in with the grandmother and the mother teaching Timothy God's word. So we need to do that. That's a parental duty, because there's somebody, using our way of speaking today, there's somebody out to get them. And who that is indicated over in 1 Peter chapter 5 and verse 8. Be of sober spirit, be on the alert. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour. So the devil, Satan, is an adversary, wanting to claim as many as possible, from as early as possible, because we know the saying, if you get a child young and develop them in a certain way, that's the way that they will develop. Now, we don't just train our children and help them to develop spiritually just by giving them a list of negative rules. Well, don't do this, don't do that, don't do something else. There's an interesting talk by Jesus over in Luke chapter 11, verses 24 through 26. Just notice what Jesus says here. When the unclean spirit comes out of a person, it passes through waterless places seeking a rest, and not finding any, it then says, I will return to my house from which I came. And when it comes, it finds it swept and put in order. Then it goes and brings along 7 other spirits more evil than itself, and they come in and live there, and the last condition of that person becomes worse than the first. So the idea here is there was a person possessed by an unclean spirit. The unclean spirit is driven out. But what does that leave? It leaves a vacuum. There's an empty space there. So the spirit can't find anywhere else to go, so it comes back. Aha, here's a nice empty space. It's all been cleaned out. Not only does the spirit reoccupy that space, but brings 7 others as well. So the end state is worse than the first. Now, you know, there's a lot of questions you might have about that passage, but using it as an illustration, it's the same with our children. That we might say, don't do this, don't do that, don't do something else. And indeed, we may stop them from doing certain things, but that's just leaving a vacuum. We've got to provide something to fill the space there. It involves teaching, it involves correction, it involves parents being a positive example. It involves promoting contact with church activities and Christians in other places. And that all requires time and priorities. But we've talked about this in the past, where you get some Christian parents who go out of their way to take their children along to church camps and to youth days in various places and so forth. Why? To give their children involvement and let their children see the church and get to know other Christians in various places, to maximize the positive input. So that's one way in which to provide protective care, and that is to help the children to deal with Satan and with sin. But there's also this topic of religious error, and indeed I'm teaching a series on that in our Sunday morning adult class. The Bible again and again and again, indeed I've been surprised at to what extent the Bible talks about truth in opposition to error, faithfulness in opposition to apostasy. Not all that is taught in the name of religion is truth. Jesus gave a warning in Matthew chapter 7 and verse 15. Beware of the false prophets who come to you in sheep's clothing, but inwardly are ravenous wolves. There are false prophets, and we talked about that 2 Sundays ago. Now, the point has been made by a range of writers and speakers over recent years that church worship to a great deal has changed in many places, and it has almost become like entertainment. You've got rock music for singing, you've got light effects, you've got stage smoke, you've got sermons that sometimes show a great deal of shallowness, sometimes sound more like a comedy sketch or something like that. And the idea has been to try to make church more appealing to young people, and indeed there have been various congregations here in Sydney where there has been a drain of young people to those places because the whole atmosphere, the whole presentation is really very appealing. But we've got to be on guard for that, because appealing is not necessarily God-pleasing. It's not necessarily truth. It's not necessarily faithfulness. Similarly, for quite a while now in various places, there's been an attraction to send children to religious schools, because there is a perception amongst many that government schools are not good. They're not good morally. They're not good spiritually. You haven't got the facilities there. Now, in some cases, yes, that may be the case, but I can say that it's not always the case. I've seen some government schools that really do a lot of work to guide children and to help children in various ways. There is a price in sending children to various religious schools, because obviously a religious school is going to be influenced by whatever religion it is part of. And so the doctrines from that particular religion will be inculcated, will be promoted through the school. And I can remember many years ago going to a school in this local area, and it was part of a church, and there were some things about that school that were very impressive. But number one, the church that it was part of was strongly against baptism having anything to do with salvation. It taught faith only and was very emphatic upon that. And what's more, it also put a strong emphasis upon premillennialism, the idea that Jesus Christ is going to come to earth and reign on earth for 1,000 years. And so I knew, even as I was visiting that school, that if our girls went there, that I would have to spend a lot of time trying to counter what they were being taught at school. And think about it. Your children may be something like 30 hours a week at school. Here, if they're listening to the sermon, they get about half an hour of a sermon and 40 minutes of a Bible class. That's just over an hour compared with 30 hours at school. Where do you think the stronger influence will be if it comes to a school that's promoting certain religious doctrines? So we have to be aware of things, and we might be acting with all good intentions, but is it working out for good? Our children are also going to be influenced by friends who go to various churches. And the reaction is, well, okay, so if a church teaches something a little bit different, is there really a problem with that? Well, I'm going to go over to 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1 and notice here what Paul said, 1 Timothy chapter 4 and verse 1, if I can get it in front of me. We'll get there eventually. The Spirit explicitly says that in later times some will fall away from the faith. Well, who will these people be? Well, they're going to be misled by false teachers. Well, what's going to be taught? Verse 3, those false teachers will forbid marriage and advocate abstaining from certain foods. You say, well, is that really significant? Well, the Spirit says that will be a mark of falling away from the faith. Teaching even things like that. It comes to premillennialism. Well, what's wrong with that idea, that Jesus will come and reign on earth in 1,000-year kingdom? Well, part of that teaching is when Christ said, when he was here during his ministry, I am about to establish the kingdom is near at hand. Premillennialism said, well, he made a mistake. He didn't know that he was going to have to postpone it. He had to postpone it, and so he's got to come back later. Well, that's saying that Jesus is a false prophet. So, we really have to be on the guard against religious error that's going to impact upon our children from various directions. And I haven't even mentioned the internet, where all sorts of stuff is taught and promoted. So you as a parent can help your children by teaching them the importance of truth. Why is truth itself important in regard to Christianity? It's essential to salvation. Well, what is truth according to Scripture? We need to teach the source of truth, which is the Bible. We need to teach specifics of truth. What is God's teaching on various subjects? We need to teach the learning of truth. How can we learn what is truth from the Bible, rather than just picking up a verse here and there? So there's a lot to be conveyed by that. Religious error can lead us away from God. So that's another area in which parents can show care and direction. And then the third area, which I quickly want to mention, is social error. It's stating the obvious to say that social attitudes have changed, and have changed dramatically here in Australia and elsewhere. We now have same-sex marriage, we have so-called gender fluidity, we have all the views promoted by the LGBTQIA+ movement. For a long time now, we've had relativism, the idea that there is no absolute right or wrong. We have the idea of tolerance, which in some ways is fine when it talks about, getting rid of prejudice and that sort of thing. But with tolerance, there is also the idea now that each individual can have their own truth, their own version of truth, and their view of truth must be respected by others. And we can link that to what somebody called hyper-individualism, where the individual's views take priority. And if one individual says black is white, then we've got to respect that perspective. Now, the fact that a lot of this is irrational doesn't seem to matter. And the spread of irrationality is evident within our society. You can see it particularly with the growth of conspiracy theories. And even science and medical science and so forth being tossed aside. And that's become the norm. Irrationality has become the norm. We've entered the age of irrationality. Now, in a way, that's not new. This idea that, well, people can just make up their own mind and advocate their own ideas and so forth. You can go back to the book of Judges in the Old Testament, and a couple of times there it says, every man did what was right in his own eyes. Judges 17 verse 6 is an example. And all these ideas are promoted by all sorts of avenues. Politicians will get on the bandwagon for some movement or another and will promote it. We've got the media with all that's involved there. We've got the internet, we've got music, lyrics, we've got newspapers, books, magazines, radio, TV, social media of all sorts, advertising. There was a time, not so many years ago, where there was a strong reaction against the amount of gambling advertising. And the government said, we'll do something about it. And now, if you look at TV, we've got even more gambling advertising than there was previously. The education system, there's a lot of good within the education system, but at the same time, from preschool onwards, the education system has to abide by and promote whatever has been legislated by government. We have street marches, we have public gatherings, we have sporting bodies who take on various ideas that have been legislated. Of course, children talking to one another promote various ideas. We've got some religious groups who want to maintain what is called inclusiveness. And so if a certain group is pictured as needing to be brought in and included, well then some churches will go down that road. Even children's TV shows for the very young and books for the very young will also promote various aspects of social change. And we've seen some discussion about that this week with one book in a library. So our children are being heavily influenced by the promotion of social change, and they're being influenced from infancy right through to adulthood, just as we are being influenced. Sometimes that might be why we fail to help our children, because we ourselves don't realise the degree to which we're being influenced. Do you know what your children are watching on TV or on the internet? Do you know what your children are listening to? Do you know what they're being taught? Do you talk to your children about these things? The Bible's aware that there are negative influences. 1 Corinthians chapter 15 and verse 33, for instance, do not be deceived. Bad company corrupts good morals. So others can influence us. Think about planting a garden. You dig up a nice patch of soil, you plant your flowers, you water them, you walk away and you never do anything else about them. What's going to happen? They're going to be overgrown with weeds. So it is with our children. If we do nothing, then the weeds will take over. So we need to understand that all sorts of negative influences are working on our children, and we need to think about, okay, what are we as parents and indeed as grandparents doing to counter these influences? We can't make the influences go away. We can't just give a list of don'ts and think that that's enough. Again, we've got to talk to our children, listen to our children, answer our children's questions, explain various things, and encourage them to use reasoning of their own so that they can deal with whatever influences come along, because there will be more. I don't know who said it first. I don't know where I heard it, but there is a saying that goes, it's a jungle out there. The idea is it's a tough world out there. There's a lot of good things, there's a lot of bad things as well. Spiritually speaking, there's a lot of negative influences in society which hinder the spiritual development of our children and indeed of ourselves. Negative influences which act as a barrier to salvation. And the danger is that we now live in a society which can take over much of the parenting role. You can put young babies in daycare. You've got indeed long-term daycare. And then you've got preschool, kindergarten, primary school. And even whilst your children are at primary school, there's before and after school care. And then there's holiday care. Indeed, you can even now take your children with you on a holiday, but at whatever resort or ship you're going to, somebody's there to take the children off your hands and look after the children. And then there's high school and TAFE and university. So before you know it, your children have gone from birth to university with all of these others having the primary influence. And if you've got parents that are heavily involved in their careers who have to give a lot of time to their jobs and to commuting, then that doesn't leave a lot of family time. So who or what is going to be the primary influence upon our children? And are those influences going to be positive or negative? Are those influences going to help or hinder your children's spiritual development and salvation? This is Mother's Day. And mothers do, generally speaking, in most situations, mothers do love their children and care for their children, want to protect their children. But it's not all down to mothers. Fathers need to be part of that as well. You can't keep the negative influences away from your children. They're going to have to learn to deal with those influences themselves as they grow older. But what you can do is to teach your children what is good and what is bad. Teach them how to resist and overcome the negative influences. Those influences are already at work in your children's lives and have been for a long time. And that will continue. Your children need your protective care and guidance now. Yes, if you're a mother, but also if you're a father as well, it needs to be a team effort. And the rest of us can help with that as well, because every one of us is an example to the children as they come here to church. So it's a very serious challenge. We need to respond to it to the best of our abilities because time is limited. Let's stand and sing.